A very good afternoon, respected speaker, chairman, and officiating member secretary, delegates, guests, senior faculties, and staff of IGNCA. Present here for today's 10th Professor Nirmal Kumar Bose Memorial Lecture. So I, Shapam Ranvir Singh, welcome you all on behalf of the Indira Gandhi National Center for the Arts. So far, 9 memorial lectures has been delivered by eminent anthropologists, archaeologists, social activists, and freedom fighters. The title of today's lecture is Buddha as an Institution Builder. So this year we are having an eminent scholar, Professor Shailendra Mehta, who will deliver today's lecture, and Venerable Geshe Dorji Damdulji as the chairperson on this year's memorial lecture. I request both the speaker and the chairperson to take the seat on the dais, please. Professor Shailendra Mehta is the President and Director, Mudra Institute of Communication, MICA, Ahmedabad. He is Distinguished Professor of Innovation and Entrepreneurship at MICA. He has his bachelor's and master's degree from St. Stephen's College and Delhi School of Economics, Delhi University, and MPhil from Balliol College, Oxford, and PhD from Harvard. Dr. Mehta has authored and co-authored several proposals that brought in over $9 million of research funding to Purdue University from the National Science Foundation, 21st Century Fund, Microsoft, Intel, and others. And Venerable Geshe Dorji Damdulji, a distinguished Buddhist scholar, is sharing today's memorial lecture. So he's presently the director of Tibet House, Cultural Center of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, New Delhi. After 15 years of study in Buddhist philosophy, he finished his Geshe Larampa degree PhD, that is PhD, in 2002 from Drempung Loseling Monastic University. He was the visiting fellow in Delhi University in the departments of philosophy, psychology, and Buddhist studies. As a customary way, let's start this event by offering our prayers to Ma Saraswati by lighting the lamp as a tribute to Goddess Saraswati. For this, I would like to request respected speaker, Professor Shailendra Mehta ji, Venerable Geshe Dorji Damdulji, and officiating member secretary, Dr. Ramesh Ghosh, and Dr. Ramaka Pant to come up on stage and light the inaugural lamp.
शुभं करोति कल्याणम् आरोग्यं धनसम्पदः आत्मबुद्धिप्रकाशाय दीपज्योतिर्नमोऽस्तु ते दीपात्वं देहि कल्याणम् देहि सर्वान् मनोरथान् यावत् करं समाप्येत तावत् त्वं सुस्थिरो भव।
May I now request our officiating member secretary IGNCA, Dr. Ramesh Ghosh, to kindly facilitate our board the guests. Now I would like to request Dr. Ramesh Ghosh to deliver the welcome address.
Good afternoon. It indeed a great honor in welcoming you all to this 10th N.K. Bose Memorial Lecture. And we have honor and great privilege to have eminent speaker and chair to deliver this particular memorial lecture. As you all know, Indira Gandhi National Center for the Arts is having a number of memorial lectures associated with our collections, some based on our area of interest, the contributions made by eminent scholars. So this memorial lecture, which was started in 1993, 10th is in series. Various eminent speakers have delivered these lectures. And if you see the topic of this year's lecture, Buddha as an institutional builder, it is something very catchy, and people will really want to know. And a person like me is very much interested that what our eminent speakers to tell us about how Buddha was having a role in institutional building, and also in current context. Like yesterday we were having a book launch of a book written on Mahatma Gandhi. So there was a various discussion that how Mahatma Gandhi is still relevant in today's time, and his political vision and political ideology. Similarly, like we have great personality in our history, and we always look forward or look backward also, like to learn from the experiences and all our history, our cultural history. One thing which I feel like I'm not the expert on this subject, but I traveled extensively, and in most part of the South Asian country. Whenever I visited, like during those meetings or conferences, one thing I always observe that delegates are being taken to some Buddha temple or some institution where some research is being done. Like so, it is something like when we see this entire Southeast Asia, and particularly like I've been to Japan, South Korea, Thailand, or other countries. The kind of people have that kind of feeling that it is not just kind of a religious thing, it is something more than that. So IGNC is always very supportive of or very active in these areas. We have a program on Buddhist studies, a postgraduate diploma in Buddhist studies currently going on, and even there are number of other postgraduate courses and research methodologies, certificate course, and folklore, and a lot of other programs are being undertaken. So these kind of lectures help us in understanding our objectives in a better manner, and we always look for the directions and views from the experts that how we can further improve our existing programs and activities, because it is always good to have expert views or views from the outside, like what we are doing within the IGNCA. Such opportunities give us chance, and when somebody is having an eminent speaker like Professor Mehta and chair like Director of Tibet House, Jane Doshi, we definitely look forward to receiving your valuable guidance. And I also thank and welcome all of you for coming and attending this particular talk, and look forward to your valuable interaction also during the lecture. And once again, I extend hearty welcome to both speaker and chair, and look forward to your session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir, for your thought-stimulating address. Now I request Venerable Geshe Dorje Damdulji to take charge of the proceedings.
I, having taken charge as the director of Tibet House, it has been since like 2012 that we started to have this very good relationship with IGNCA. And then as the officiating, the member secretary very clearly indicated that IGNCA started the diploma course in Buddhism. So when the concept was first conceived in IGNCA, and they invited me as one of the resource persons, and we already started the master's course there from Tibet House, and I was so happy to see that IGNCA is taking initiative in starting such a program, and I'm ready to offer to give whatever materials that we have prepared to IGNCA, because IGNCA is a huge institution, highly recognized, and so that way the IGNCA plays a very important role. And I'm very happy about this. For the last many years, then I had the honor and a privilege to be a part of many of the IGNC programs. And today, for the 10th Professor N.K. Bose Memorial Lecture, we have a very prominent scholar, again, more than me being the chair here. I feel so honored again to be a part of IGNC, to come to know Professor Mehta ji, and just doing the very brief interaction with him before we came down, I learned a lot from him, and particularly as you can unfold from his presentation, the lecture, there are many things which I, being brought up in this culture, I took for granted. And then what Professor Mehta ji, as an outsider, he was looking at things from a very contemporary perspective, which is just amazing. Just for information, why I'm saying this today lecture is of special relevance and interest is that His Holiness the Dalai Lama, as many years ago, Tibetan medicine was already operating to such great efficacy, particularly amongst the Indians, so efficacious, and yet never did that happen to our mind that why not we study Tibetan medicine in collaboration with say Ayurveda, in collaboration with allopathic medicine. His Holiness the Dalai Lama, since many years ago, he said that the Tibetan medicine must be studied, must undertake some research in the contemporary context, along with the allopathic medicine. How the allopathic medicine, they do research, we must be updated to that level. This was what he said since many years ago. So now, today we see that, say, when I was first in England, in Cambridge, as a fellow there, say, I started to learn about the oldest universities and so forth, and then one of which happened to be Nalanda, Takshashila, then the Virgamal Shield, and so forth. I was so fascinated. And then today, I'm meeting somebody who really embodies that knowledge, how to see that in the light of the contemporary, through the lens of contemporary, the analysis and inquiry. So we are very fortunate that something of a great treasure which once happened in India, although unfortunately it passed away, it died, but now it's being revived because it spread across the world to China, to Tibet, Sri Lanka and so forth. And then now what was in Tibet was brought back to India, and if we are able to see the same, how Dr. Mehta ji is going to explain to us, the same thing you can see in the monastic universities in South India, where the study programs are so rigorous and so, they say, the contemporary, very rigorous. You'll be fascinated. So what I see today's talk, Professor, the Shailendra Mehta ji's talk is going to be so relevant, and particularly for the young researchers, that is so relevant. Okay, so without much ado, what I'd like to invite Dr. Shailendra ji, who was already introduced by the moderator, and then we will have about like 1 hour, and at the end we can have some question answers. So this is how we're going to have this the lecture. So we are so happy. Let me welcome Professor Shailendra ji to take over and enlighten us with your research.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Since my mother is here, my first respects are to her. Venerable Geshe Dorji Damdulji, the Member Secretary of IGNCA, distinguished friends, ladies and gentlemen. It's indeed a privilege and a pleasure to be invited to give the 10th Nirmal Bose Memorial Lecture here at IGNCA. Nirmal Bose was an extraordinary scholar, a polymath, and above all, an individual who engaged deeply with the world around him. Not only was he a scholar, but he was, in the true sense of the term, an engaged scholar. This is because he was deeply influenced by Mahatma Gandhi and worked very closely with him in the last 15 or so years of Gandhiji's life, part of it as his secretary. This included the tumultuous years just preceding independence when Gandhiji himself embedded himself in East Bengal in Noakhali, when everything was burning around him. Nirmal Bose was with Gandhiji. Surprisingly, for someone so close to Gandhiji, he was an agnostic. As he wrote, and I quote from page 23 of Bhattacharya and Sarkar's compilation of his works, "For me, the existence of a higher purpose has neither been proven nor disproven." The reason why I mention this is because this is a very Buddhist position to take. So, for that reason also, the theme that I have chosen sort of flows very nicely from the works of Nirmal Bose. Now, Ramchandra Guha has written that while many people call themselves Gandhians, only two intellectuals said so. One was J.C. Kumarappa, and the other one was Nirmal Bose. And this is the tragedy of modern India, that we had Marxists, we had liberals, we had socialists, we had communists, we had all kinds of isms, but very few intellectuals called themselves Gandhian. Though, of course, a lot of people in society and in politics, fortunately, called themselves Gandhians. Now, he was also a rare intellectual, rarer even today, who was equally fluent in English as well as in an Indian language, that is Bengali. This gave him access to a conceptual scheme which may be called the Indic way of thinking, and as a result, his writing is nowhere a slavish imitation of Western models. In fact, I would like to mention here that what is most needed in India today is going back to what Aurobindo called the importance of original thinking, by which I mean, again, as Gandhiji put it, we are open to all the currents in the world, but we are blown away by none. Unfortunately, a lot of contemporary scholarship has been blown away from their roots, lock, stock, and barrel, and we have embraced Western models so thoroughly that we are unable to look at our own reality and our own environment with a fresh set of eyes. The paper that I'm presenting today is a small attempt in that direction, and I hope it is not going to be the only one in this particular field. As his student and translator André Bete, himself a very distinguished sociologist, was to write, and this is in the foreword to a book that he translated by Nirmal Bose on the structures of Hindu life from Bengali to English. By the way, this is a very rare phenomenon where a scholarly book is translated, by which I mean a non-fiction book. A lot of fiction is translated, right? But a non-fiction book translated from an Indian language and used reverentially in scholarly discourse, translated from an Indian language into English. I think so. André Bete did that with Nirmal Bose's work. And in that book, he was to write, in the social sciences, the younger generation of Indians, and this is elaborating on the point that I've just made, were impressed more by the authority of Western scholars than by the spirit behind Western science. He himself greatly admired the spirit, but sought to preserve his independence in relation to the established schools of thought, unquote. And he was to add that his death, that is the death of Nirmal Bose, marked the end of an epoch in the history of social sciences in India. A complete bibliography of Nirmal Bose's book, which I also saw in the book edited by Behura and Mohanty, Passage Through Indian Civilization, the bibliography of his English works runs to 36 pages. And the bibliography of his Bengali works runs for another 22 pages. Now, that is a serious intellectual. And more importantly, one who has bridged the two worlds, the worlds of Indian thought and the worlds of Western thought. For my purpose here today, the most remarkable thing about the work of Nirmal Bose was that he combined ideas from Indology and social science. And today, I plan to do exactly the same thing. Bose maintains, and here I'm quoting from Behura and Mohanty again, that the hallmark of Indian civilization is the unit of economic and social organization. And in particular, he paid a lot of attention to the study of guilds. So I'm going to talk about guilds today in the process of building my larger argument. He indicates, and this is in one of his works on technology being created by tribals, he actually went to Indological sources to see how technology was created in and how it was recorded in Indian history. And then he looked at the history of guilds. In particular, he refers to a guild, an inscription from Nasik, and where there was a guild of which basically focused on oil pressing. And he wrote a very prominent study of the evolution of the oil pressing technology in India. So this is a methodology that I'm going to follow in my lecture today. And the topic that I have for today is Buddha as an institution builder. Now, this topic is not something that I have come upon recently. This was, I will claim, the missing link that I had been looking for several years. Because the question that I asked myself, and this is how I came upon this topic, and it came through two chains of argument that I want to share with you. I asked myself, why is it that American universities are so good? I had the privilege of studying there and teaching there for almost 20 years. And my answer, which I wrote in a paper about 6 years ago, was that it had to do with their institutional structure and their governance. That paper is on the web, and I gave that talk at MIT. You can look it up if you have an interest. I won't go into the details. But then the natural question as an Indian, as somebody who had returned to India around that time, the question was, but of course, if American universities are good, and the European universities before that were good, what about the Indian universities, which of course were the ones that started the ball rolling in the first place? So for the last 6 years or 7 years, I have been on a one-track mission to look at the institutional history of these 7 universities. Remind you, it was not just Nalanda and Takshila. There were 7 of them, and it would be useful to list them here. The oldest, of course, was Takshila. And a couple of years ago, I had a chance to spend a full day there. It's a suburb of Islamabad. I also had a chance to spend a full day in Nalanda. And I do hope to visit some of the others which are now in Bangladesh. So the 7 were, of course, Takshila, Nalanda, Vallabhi, Vikramshil, Udantapuri, Jagaddal, and Sompura, the last 3 of which are currently in Bangladesh. The first is in Pakistan, the other 3 are in India. So the institutional history of these 7 universities, the fact that they functioned as a system, the fact that people moved back and forth, the fact that they borrowed ideas from each other, the fact that they competed with each other, was something that I recognized immediately from how American universities function today. And the fact that there was not just one, but that there were 7 of them, and that they competed at any given time, 5 or 6 were competing with each other for ideas, for people, for thought, for debates. I think that was the crux. But then I'm telling that story elsewhere. That story has become so big that it will now be the subject of several books, I would think. But I've given a series of lectures. I already talked about the lecture at MIT, which was the big overview. I gave a talk about a month ago in Shimla at the Indian Institute for Advanced Study on another aspect of what made these universities possible, which was the fact that we developed perhaps the most stringent codes of academic freedom and free speech. In fact, we gave the thought, the notion of free speech to the world, and I trace the history and the evolution of that academic freedom and free speech from the Rig Veda all the way up through Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, through, of course, the dialogues of the Buddha, through Milindapanha, the dialogue between King Menandros in Greek, and the Buddhist monk Nagasena, all the way down to Gandhiji. So all of these aspects are coming out of this grand quest to understand how these universities functioned. Now, one missing link that I could not for a while understand is why was it that all these 7 universities, Takshila initially did not start out as a Buddhist university because it predates the Buddha, right? We know from the archaeological evidence that it existed from the 8th century BC, and that also is there in the evidence. By the way, it's mentioned both in the Mahabharata and in the Ramayana. So it existed, of course, much before 5th century or 6th century BC, which is the time of the Buddha. But the latter part of Takshila and then all the other 6 universities were Buddhist. So the question that I asked myself is, why could the Hindus and the Jains not create these universities? The Hindus and the Jains had centers of learning, but not really universities. And this is where the missing link basically came to me, which is because the Buddhists had a technology which nobody else in the world had at that time, which is the monastery. Now remember, we think of technology as a physical thing, right? We think of semiconductors, we think of planes, we think of this microphone. These are technologies. But let's not forget that equally important, sometimes more important, are technologies in the social realm. Democracy is a technology. A corporation is a technology. And in fact, let's not forget that the reason why the British were able to capture India in 1757 is because 150 years prior to that, they had created a new technology, which is the joint stock company, which in turn they had borrowed from the Dutch. I'm going to come to that a little later. This is also part of my talk. But these technologies of a joint stock company, of a corporation, were critical because they were able to deploy capital, and they were able to deploy organization, and they were able to deploy troops in India because of this technology. And so as a result, both the Dutch, they conquered Indonesia, and the British captured India. So all of these were a result of the fact that they had mastered and created a technology called the joint stock company. So that company also has a history which is dipped in blood. It's not a very palatable history. We look at only positive sides of it, but the antecedents of many of these technologies, some of these physical technologies, are quite gory. But today I'm going to talk about the technology which only gave good things to the world, which is the technology of the monastery, the Buddhist monastery. So the plan of my talk, since I have a lot to say and I have more material than I could possibly cover in a full day, so I'm going to skip a lot of the details. But let me give you the outline of my talk as I'm going to lay out my argument. So I'm going to talk about first that Buddha is known for 3 things, and I'm going to add a 4th. I'm going to talk about, remember, as a social scientist, you cannot just look at a phenomenon in isolation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the era of the Buddha. What was the era like, which allowed him and the dharma that he propagated and the technology that he created, the monastery. How was it that the technology was created as an interplay between the individual and the environment? I'm going to talk a little bit about the background of the Buddha, which I think is extremely important to understand if we are to understand the technology that he created. I'm going to talk a little bit about the social movements. I'm going to talk a little bit about the physical setting of India. Surprisingly, there is an aspect of the geography and the climate of India that had a role to play in this. I'm going to talk also about some Buddhist scriptures, the Vinaya in particular, some general principles, and then link it all up to economic aspects. And that will complete the whole picture. So I hope I'm going to lay a fairly intricate argument out. So it's important for me to create these milestones. So it's well known that Buddha was born in 563 before the Common Era, in Lumbini in Nepal. His father, Shuddhodhana, and his mother, Maya Devi, were residents of Koshala, which was one of the 16 Mahajanpads. Now, this is extremely important to appreciate. The Mahajanpads were the 16 republics which practiced a form of democracy. So, these Mahajanpads basically had elections, they had voting, they had people who were rotated in leadership positions, and more importantly, they had a communal form of organization which was very egalitarian and non-sectarian. The details of Koshala are known not just in the Buddhist scriptures, from the Anguttara Nikaya, for example, and the Jain Bhagavati Sutra, but from also a lot of the inscriptional and archaeological evidence. I'm not going to go into those details. But the Buddha is remarkable in human history because not only did he create a great religion, that of course is one of his biggest contributions. It's one of the greatest creations of the human mind, that is the Buddhist religion. But he was a great philosopher. The philosophy that he propounded of Pratitya Samutpad, and I'm now using the Sanskrit term, or Patichi Samutpad in Pali, is the first complete analysis of causality and systems thinking that the world has seen. It's a philosophy par excellence. So not only was he the propounder of a great religion, he propounded a great philosophy. If that was not enough, he also propounded and created a great system of meditation. So all of these three aspects are well known. But these three aspects alone make him unique in the annals of world history, because no other founder of a religion created a philosophical method of thought, or for that matter, a system of meditation. Usually, it's big enough to be ranked as one of the greats in human history to do even one of these. Right? That's an academic. That's something for the ages. But Buddha did all three, and I'm going to argue that he did a fourth thing as well, which is he created the world's first self-perpetuating corporation, which has survived for 2,500 years. Now, we think of corporations as economic corporations. But remember, corporations can also be charitable corporations or a charitable trust, what in English law was called the eleemosynary corporation. That, by the way, was an innovation of English law. That is what ultimately made British universities possible. And more importantly, the first such corporation that was created in the New World, that is in the Northern Hemisphere, was Harvard University. The first corporation in the free world. It was also an eleemosynary corporation or a charitable trust. So the charitable trust is also a technology that basically gave rise to these great institutions of the Western world. And by the way, the founder of the University of California system mentioned that in the last 500 years in the West, only about 80 institutions have survived over 500 years. Only 80. More than 70 of these are universities. 6 of them are parliaments. So the oldest surviving institutions in the Western world are all eleemosynary corporations, or what we in our terms would call a charitable trust. Now, what I'm going to argue is that the Buddha is the one who created the world's first charitable trust in the form of the monastery. So we know the monastery as a set of rules, as a set of values. That is what monks throughout the world who are Buddhists celebrate every day. However, it was a lot more. It was also an economic technology that the Buddha had created, and that is what I want to dwell upon today. Because I think unless we understand this, we're not going to fully understand either Buddhism or Buddha or the contributions of the two to world history. So, a little bit, remember I said I will start with the environment. So what did the 6th century BC in India look like? So here, the best term that I can think of is actually from German. Karl Jaspers came up with this, and he called it Achsenzeit. Now, this is a word that is immediately accessible to us in Sanskrit. Achsen comes from aksha, the old Indo-European root. Aksha in Sanskrit means axle, right? Axle of a cart, for example, or of a chariot. Zeit, again, I won't go into the Indo-European root, but it's the same root has the same root as samaya, or time. So Achsenzeit means the Akshakala. Now, why did he call it the Achsenzeit, or the axial age in English? Is because he said, and I quote, and this is from the English translation in 1953 of Karl Jasper's work, Confucius and Lao Tzu were living in China. In India, the Upanishads, Buddha and Mahavira were there. The Hebrew prophets, that is Isaiah, Jeremiah and others, were alive at that time. And Greece, of course, had Homer, Plato and Aristotle. So he's talking about the period from 8th century BC to the 3rd century BC, which is also the period that I'm focusing on roughly. So there's a huge churning which is happening globally. There are all these religious figures in the 4 great traditions of the world that are simultaneously born, and there's a huge churning that is happening all over the world. But in India, this churning is particularly intense. In fact, I would argue that this churning is most intense in India. And this churning is driven both by people who live in settled communities and people who are wanderers, right? Now remember, India has had wanderers, or people who have had no fixed address, who moved from place to place in search of salvation from the times of the Rig Veda. In the Rig Veda, there are 2 terms that are used for wanderers who go from place to place in search of salvation. One is Muni, and that is taken to be a term for people who are in the Shramanic tradition, like the later Buddhists and the Jains. And the other term that is used in the Atharva Veda is the Vratya. The Vratya were people who were within the Hindu fold, but who traveled from place to place, again in search of salvation. Vratya, it is said, comes from the word vrata, that is, they took on some spiritual precepts, not very different from what Buddhists did later on. Now, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad also talks about the Bhikshu Charika, that is the people who wandered from place to place for Bhiksha. Bhikshacharyam is the term that it uses, and this is from Brihadaranyaka Upanishad 3.5.1. Now, so there were a lot of these wanderers, and when Buddha set out for salvation, he became one as well. So at the age of 29, Buddha sets out to seek salvation. Now, for a minute, think of a 29-year-old somewhere in the 6th century BC. And the important thing for him is that A, he is a prince. B, he is 29 years of age. C, he has already been married and has had a son. And D, that he lives in an age which has a very interesting form of economic organization called the Shreni. Remember, I talked about the Shreni in Nirmal Bose's work. A Shreni is a guild. That is, just as agriculture is the mainstay of rural economy, Shrenis are the mainstay of the urban economy. All the production that happens in urban areas happened in India through almost all. All the organized production happened through Shrenis. Shrenis were basically organizations of people who were of craftspeople. Now, in the various texts, there are 8 lists of 18, 26, 100, people have compiled lists of 150, including everything from leather to cloth, that is cotton cloth, to silk, to jewelry, to metal, to ironwork, to carpentry, everything, basically. And more importantly, there's a particular organization that the Shrenis have. First of all, the Shrenis take the organization from the Mahajanapadas, and they are democracies. It's very important to understand that even though these are guilds of producers, they're democracies. How do we know this? We know this from, I won't go into it. I mean, there are hundreds of pieces of evidence that we can adduce to that, because so much of inscriptional material is available on these guilds. And there is a lot of material on guilds in the Buddhist Jatakas, for example, the 547 Jataka stories about the life of the Buddha. Plus, there is a lot of material about the guilds in the Dharma Shastras. Again, we tend to focus on Manu or Manava Dharma Shastra, but there were in Kane's magisterial summary, there are 104 others. So we tend to sort of look at Manu as the be-all and end-all, but there are many others, and I will quote from some of them. But all of these are united in basically saying that Shrenis are extremely important. And on what is equally important is that these Shrenis have the support of the state. So whether you look at Narada Smriti or Parashara Smriti, and I have all the quotes, I think I'm not going to have the time to do that. I'm happy to pull this out for Q&A. But these kings, these kingdoms are told very explicitly by the Dharma Shastras that if you're to be a good king, you have to make sure that every Nigama, which is another corporation, every Shreni, every Puga, every Matha, every Pashandika, so every sect, including Mathas, all of these have to be protected. And more importantly, unless the king protects them, he cannot be called a righteous king, a Dharma Raja, for example. So it's very clear that all of these organizations do not just exist in a vacuum. They have their own codes, which the Dharma Shastra is called their Samaya. And these codes are sanctioned by the Dharma Shastras. And the king is required to uphold them. So please understand that these Janpadas are there, which are very democratic. These Shrenis are there, which are highly productive and democratic. I won't have time. We did an exhaustive study of the European guilds also. By the way, the European guilds only become very prominent in the Middle Ages. They do start in the Roman era, but there they have a huge deficiency in the sense that they are what are called societies, where people voluntarily come together. But if even one person leaves, that whole society falls apart. That was not the case with Shrenis. I won't go into those details, but the Shrenis in India are much more robust. And more importantly, they have democratic functioning. And as a result, and they have state protection. So all of these aspects are extremely important. And the Buddha, because he was a prince, because he was being trained to take over his role as a king, it is a fair conjecture to believe that he would have been involved deeply in the regulation, the encouragement, the support, and the functioning of all of these entities. So, and furthermore, he had 29 years of his life to devote to this before he sets out on his journey for salvation. Now, the other thing, so now Buddha has gone out. Picture this, he's gone out for his salvation. This is the age of 29. For the next 6 years, he wanders. Just like all of these munis, vratyas, bhikshus, shramanas, basically all of them are wandering. And now something interesting happens. The monsoons. And regardless of whether you're a Hindu or a Jain or a Buddhist, during the monsoon season, if you're a seeker for salvation, you're asked to stay in one place. Now, why is that? One is practical, right? In those days, when the means of communication were not so robust and the roads were not as robust as they are today, large parts of the country would be cut off. And so it would be physically dangerous to embark on a journey at that time. But also, because almost all of these sects were very careful about ahimsa, about nonviolence, because there's such a proliferation of animal life at that point, from microscopic to visible to large, that to venture out means invariably to engage in hinsa, right? Because some or the other animal or prani or a living being would be crushed under your feet. So the injunction was that in the 3 monsoon months, you have to stay in one place. And this was applicable to everybody. Now the Buddhists, so Buddha also did that. And basically when he founded Buddhism, he also insisted that for the 3 monsoon months, the bhikkhus should stay in one place. And then, of course, they could go back and engage with the world. Now, when they stayed in one place, society pitched in to help. So, society basically created places where they could shelter for the 3 months. And they were called aramas and aramas, mostly sangharams, they were called. And the literature, the Pali literature, has direct mentions of 9 of them. The Velu Vanaram, the Jivakaram, the Ambapali Vana, actually gifted by Amrapali, a woman. Udambari Karam, Kukutaram, Jetvanaram, Badarikaram, and Nigrodharam. These are the 8 that are mentioned in the Pali literature. 3 of which, Jivakaram, Jetvanaram, and Ghoshtiaram, Ghoshti being the 9th, they are still in place. They have been identified, they have been excavated, we know where they are. So the point is that these arams were created by society for the monks to be in when they were traveling and staying in one place for the rainy season. Gradually, they became available to monks throughout the year as rest houses. When they were going from place A to place B, they could stay there for as long as they wanted. And this is the innovation of the Buddha. He ultimately allowed these sangharams to become permanent dwelling places. Earlier, they would only function for the 3 monsoon months or occasionally when the people came. But he allowed them to function year-round. So he basically allowed monks to congregate in one place throughout the year. And what is interesting is that in such a situation, he said, what is going to bind you? You're going to be a community. So he said, the most important thing that will bind you, and he says this explicitly, and you can find this in many places in the Pali Vinaya, and I'm pretty sure this is there elsewhere as well, is the Patimokkha. The Patimokkha is the basic vow that you take when you enter a monastery, and you repeat it. It's like it's the thing that binds everybody together. I'll come to that in a minute. Now, what is interesting is that along with this, the Buddha did something else. In almost all the Hindu traditions and in the Jain tradition, the master has the right to nominate a successor. That is to say, if there is a guru or a teacher or a master, he or she nominates a successor. He refused to do that. In fact, in the Pali texts, the minister of Bindusara, who was the king at that time, Bimbisara who was the king at that time. In Pali, he's called Vassakara. He asked Ananda after the Buddha had passed away that how are you going to survive? The Buddha has not nominated a successor. And he said, the basis for unity is the values, the Patimokkha. So the Patimokkha is the unifying mantra, basically, that the Buddha had given. Okay. Now, I mentioned the enabling environment and the guilds. Let me mention one interesting part about guilds that may not be that well known. I stumbled upon this when I was reading the text of the Mudra Rakshasa, one of the most fascinating plays ever written in any language. Manoj Joshi is now taking this all over India as the play Chanakya. Now, the reason why this is interesting is that this is the only source that we have properly which lays out in great detail the relationship between Chandragupta Maurya and Chanakya. Right? Elsewhere in the Buddhist and in the Jain texts, there are a few snippets of how they interacted. But really, if you have to understand how Chandragupta Maurya became the emperor that he became, you have to read this text. And I want to point to a very interesting dialogue that happens between the head of a Shreni. Remember, I talked about Shrenis. So this is now the head of jewelers, and his name is Chandan Dasa, and the Buddha and Chanakya are having a conversation. So Chanakya has summoned Chandan Dasa, and I won't go into that as to why he's summoned there. In fact, Chanakya thinks that he's plotting against the king. That's a separate story. But what I want to mention is that when Chanakya calls Chandan Das, or Chandan Dasa, properly speaking, and greets him, the first thing that he asks him, Bho Shreshtin Chandan Dasa, and I'm quoting now from Sanskrit because Chanakya speaks in Sanskrit and Chandan Das replies in Prakrit. And he asks him about Vyavharana Vriddhi Labha. So the first thing that he asks him is, how's business? Vriddhi is what is your earning, and Labha is what is your profit. So the first question that he asks is, so how's your income and how's your revenue and how's your profit? And Chandan Dasa says, Akhandita me vanijya. He replies in Prakrit. In Sanskrit that would be Akhandita me vanijya. That is, my enterprise is proceeding unhindered. So remember, the reason why I mention this is because the state, and Chanakya here is now the minister, the prime minister of the king. So the first question that he's worried about is, how's business? If the economic sources of the nation are not strong, the nation will never be strong. So he asks that, and this indicates how important Shrenis are. Now, Shrenis, as I mentioned, involve democratic functioning. And so the Buddha would have been familiar with all of those. And not only that, and he would also have been familiar with the constitution of the Shakyan tribe, for example, or of Koshala, the Mahajanpada. And more interestingly, in his final sermon, the Mahaparinirvan Sutta in Pali, his final sermon, which is the conversation between him and his cousin Ananda, who's also one of his main disciples, he specifically talks about how this democratic functioning is critical to the functioning of the state. And he said, and this is now he's talking about the second of the republics, that is the Vajji Republic, or in Sanskrit, which is Vriji. And he basically says, and I won't quote here the time, I'm running short of time. I will only give you the English version. He says, so how are the Vajjiyans doing? And he said, they're doing fine. So he says, as long as the Vajjiyans assemble regularly and consult regularly, they will not go into decline. No parihani is the term that he uses. So he says, as long as the Vajjiyans engage in democratic consultation, they will be invincible. So all of these things basically are things that he would have been familiar with. So these all basically go into the development of the monastery. Now, the other thing that I want to mention is that when he creates the monastery, the Buddha also creates rules for democratic functioning. Remember, we don't know what were the actual rules that were used in the 16 Mahajanpadas. But we can guess what they were because the same rules have been brought into the Pali Vinaya. In fact, all the Vinayas of the Buddhist texts. And those rules indicate how the monks should function amongst themselves. And it turns out that in the Pali Vinaya, the 14th section of a section called Chullavagga is precisely about this. It's about voting procedures. And I won't go into the details. But all the different kinds of votings are there. There is majority voting. There is secret voting. In some cases, unanimity may be required. Details are given about how juries may be created. What are the good characteristics of a jury member? Even select committees. If you're going to have, there are some things that must be put to the whole assembly. There are some things which are technical and therefore must go to a select committee. So the rules for how you bifurcate business are all there. Now, interestingly enough, the first people to look at this were people in the 1920s, 1910s and 1920s, when the British were basically saying that India was unfit for democratic functioning because it didn't know democracy. So people like Kashi Prasad Jaiswal, the great scholar of Sanskrit and Pali and Prakrit, and many others wrote a series of books. I think about 10 of them were written about many aspects of this. But since that time, not a whole lot of work has been done on that, and we have largely forgotten how these monasteries and these shrenis and these Mahajanpadas basically functioned, that is, as democratic, fully democratic entities. And by the way, the same democracy is visible, and I won't have time to go into that, in the Rig Veda. There are at least 7 words for association, including Sabha and Samiti and Nigam, and all of these, Palika, all of these words that we use for local self-government today are there in the Rig Veda. And they also are aspects of the same functioning. So the point that I'm making is that all of these things were known to the Buddha, and he incorporated that. So let me now come to the final part of what I want to share with you, which in my view indicates the real genius of the Buddha, because this is something that has not been fully appreciated. Before that, very quickly, the Buddha also allowed, remember these are also aspects of the functioning of the monastery, and these also have to be brought together in the same place so that you see how wonderful this institution was. First, schisms are allowed. So he never insisted on uniformity. He said as long as if there are 5 bhikshus who disagree with the majority, they can secede and create their own sangha. Perfectly allowed. Remember, he didn't nominate a successor. He said, my principles are what should guide you. And each person has the right to take those principles and interpret them the way he or she wants it. And as long as there are 5 of them who agree, they can go and set up their own sangha, and it has the same validity as anything else. Then he named his sangha the Chatudisi Sangha, the sangha of 4 directions. That word is extremely important. This is Chaturdisha, saying that it is open to all castes, creeds, colors, everybody, men, women, young, old, highborn, common people, rich, poor, everybody is welcome. Unity. He focuses that the unity of the principles is what binds the community together, what he calls samagrata or samagrata in Sanskrit. Also form, not content. For example, as long as you adhere to the principles, you could change the precepts, you could change the rules, as long as you didn't change the principles. For example, there was one sect of Buddhists from which the Mahayanists came out, which is the Tibetan tradition, which basically said that the rules of Vinaya, that is the rules of the monastery, are not the most important thing. The most important thing is the meditation tradition. So they were the people who completely broke away from monasteries. The Zen tradition of China, the Chan tradition of China, the Zen tradition of Japan, and the Son tradition of Korea come from that. So even that is allowed. So imagine the Catholicity, basically, that the Buddha demonstrated. And more importantly, very explicitly, he makes a point to accommodate people who are very different from each other. So again, this is something that is not very well known, that his two major disciples were Sariputta and Moggallana. Sariputta was very fair. Moggallana was very dark. Similarly, his two most prominent female disciples that he singled out as models of virtue were Khema, who was very fair, and Uppalavanna, who was very dark. In fact, the name Uppalavanna is Sanskrit Utpalavarna. Utpal is the blue lotus. So she was as dark as the blue lotus. So the point is that this is equality in its extreme. And I won't have time to go into a fascinating text that has never been translated from Sanskrit. This is from one of the Avdans, where there is a conversation between a Chandal king and a Brahmin whose daughter wants to marry his son. And they are basically arguing about whether there is any distinction between people on the basis of birth. And fascinating story. So the point is, very clearly, it is also a very egalitarian egalitarian system. So the final part, I think we want to leave some time for questions and answers, so I will be brief here. The most fascinating and rather neglected aspect of the Mool Sarvastivad Vinaya, which is also the Vinaya of the Tibetan tradition, the copy that we have was actually redacted in the 9th century in none other than Vikramshil. So this Mool Sarvastivad Vinaya was the constitution of Nalanda and Vikramshil. This is how these were the rules by which those monasteries and universities functioned. So Gregory Chopin, the professor at UCLA, has written 60 papers on the economic aspects of the functioning of these monasteries. And I want to summarize this. I've read all of them. And I want to just summarize the essence of what he's saying and basically conclude thereafter. So what he says, so once he says, and this is in the Mool Sarvastivad Vinaya, in the Vinaya Vastu. Now, by the way, the Mool Sarvastivad Vinaya runs into 8,000 pages. It's 4,000 folios, 8,000 pages. It's a huge document. A French scholar has called it one of the masterpieces of world literature and a masterpiece of Sanskrit. So it ought to be studied. The original was in Sanskrit. Most of the Sanskrit is lost. Some fragments have been recovered from Gandhar and other places. A complete translation exists in Chinese, and a complete translation exists in Tibetan. Now, the beauty of the translations into Tibetan is that they are so accurate. In mathematical terms, the mapping is 1-to-1. It's completely unambiguous. The same word is mapped to the other word in both directions. So Rahul Sankrityayan was able to reconstruct many Sanskrit texts by retranslating from Tibetan, and when in some cases the originals were subsequently found, and it was discovered that they were word for word accurate. So the Tibetans did a phenomenal job of translating from Tibetan to Sanskrit. And so this Mool Sarvastivad Vinaya should be translated back into Sanskrit completely and made available for scholars to study throughout the world, because it has fascinating insights about the development of institutions and of the development of Indian society at that time. And this makes this text quite unique. The tragedy is that most of it is untranslated in any language and exists only in Chinese and in Tibetan, which makes it very difficult for most scholars. We have one exception here, but it makes it very difficult for people, like common people like me, to access this text. So what is happening in this text? So I'm going to quote from just one of the papers that Gregory Chopin has written, which is the following. So a group of monks have created some lay people in Shravasti have basically created an aram or a vihara. And they want to build some more. So they go to the monks and say, look, we want to build this aram, we want to build this vihar. At that time, it is said that these houses used to be, or these buildings used to be 6 to 7 stories high. And it turned out that the maintenance was not very good, so some of these would crumble. So some of the leading citizens of the city got together and approached the Buddha and said, look, we want to give money so that these buildings can be created and repaired and maintained. So the Buddha says, fine. So they go to the bhikshus and give the money and come and then wait, nothing happens. They go back to the bhikshus say, sorry, we are not allowed to use money. We're not allowed to deal with money. So they go back to the Buddha and the Buddha says, it's okay, you can deal with money. So then the construction starts. But then they say, okay, so how are we going to manage this endowment? That will require that we give this money to the Shrenis on interest, because the Shrenis will invest it in their business and then will give the interest back to the monastery. So the citizens of the city propose that. Again, the bhikshus say, sorry, we are not allowed to deal with interest. So again, they go back to the Buddha, and the Buddha says there's no harm in taking interest if it is for a good cause. If it is for an accepted cause, you can take interest. So they go back again and give the money on interest, except that this time they give it to the same people who had donated the money. Lo and behold, those people are not able to repay the interest because they're not business people. They just use it and they're not able to repay it. So the next time they go and invest it with rich people. They also, unfortunately, do not return the money. So then they go and invest with poor people. They also don't return the money. So they come running to the Buddha and says, what do we do? So then the Buddha, and this is another part of the functioning of the Buddha as it is revealed in the Mool Sarvastivad Vinaya. He then says, look, you have to pay proper attention to the documentation. You must have a collateral. He says, when you're giving this money away, it may be for a monastery, but you have to be business savvy. You have to have a collateral. You have to have a proper contract. The contract must have the year, the month, the date on which the money was given. You have to mention the rate of interest. You have to mention all of these things. More importantly, you must have a witness. You must have a notary. You must even have a person who guarantees the loan. And the loan guarantee must be twice the amount. So all this is there. And they start doing this, and that's when the self-perpetuating corporation, that is the monastery, basically comes into being. Because remember, throughout the world, there were people who were spiritual seekers. But nobody was able to create an organization which perpetuated itself. Again, I'm not going to go into the details, I don't have the time. But the monastery demonstrates every aspect of what economists and social scientists call a corporation. The fact that it must be self-perpetuating, that it must be separate from the people who are in it, it must have its own identity, it must be able to enter into legal relationships which are independent of the monks, that there should be a signature authority, that there should be an endowment, that the endowment should be managed. All of these things he puts in place. And all of these things allow the monastery to thrive. It has thrived for 2,500 years. It is a mistake to believe that Buddhism disappeared from India. It never disappeared from Bengal and the border of Bengal and Bihar. Bengal and Burma or Myanmar today. But be that as it may, because of the fact that any 5 people could come together, any 5 bhikshus could come together and create a sangha, the sangha has been recreated. And Ambedkar basically was instrumental in a lot of that activity. So I hope I have, with this, been able to share with you a series of observations about the development of the corporation. So now, before I close, I want to read 2 or 3 excerpts which will indicate to you why this line of inquiry that I've engaged in today is so important. Now, as I was researching the history of the charitable trust as indeed the corporation. And by the way, I won't go into the details of the link between the Shrenis and the corporations and the Shrenis, and I've already talked about Shrenis and the monastery. But the history of the charitable contribution, the charitable trust, that was written in 1884 by Zolman. And basically he says, and this, I saw this recently and it caused a twinge in my heart. He said the charitable impulse is not known amongst people who are non-Christian. He said only the Christians could create a charitable trust. Remember, they created it perhaps at least 1,000 years later, right? So he says the law of charitable uses is unknown to the jurisprudence of purely pagan peoples. That is all of us here. And he says that it was only Christianity that gave this power. So I hope the one thing that we can take away, and by the way, this is the history of the charitable contribution. He said charity is a product of Christianity. It's absolutely not so. Of course, Christianity has its own glorious history, nothing to take away from that. But I think to give credit where credit is due, the first charitable trust was created by none other than the Buddha. Now, the reason why this is important is I want to now complete the link with the universities. Remember, these same charitable trusts made Nalanda possible. Nalanda had a similar endowment that was managed. Of course, I wouldn't go into it. They had another stream of financing which came from the land revenue of the villages. But the two together basically created that. And more importantly, not only did it create the monastery, it created the university. And more importantly, the university also, each of these universities was global in character and universal in character. For example, Nalanda, amongst the heads, remember these were all democratically chosen, and I won't go into, there's an inscriptional evidence that I have of how these heads were chosen. But be that as it may, Gunamati and Sthirmati came from the west, Dharmpala from the south, Asanga and Vasubandhu from Peshawar. So basically the heads of Nalanda came from all parts of the country. Just as the monasteries could have people from literally anywhere in the world. They had Chinese and other members as well that basically came. And Veeradeva, one of the heads of Nalanda, was elected by the monks and the scholars of Nalanda. Again, nobody appointed, so to speak, the head of these institutions. They were elected by the scholars themselves. Okay, so to sum up, one of the most important contributions that anybody has made to institution building was the creation of the Buddhist monastery. The reason is that for the first time it gave a self-perpetuating body, a structure, a code, a law that allowed it to continue uninhibited. Of course, there was the ebb and flow. In some places it was lost, in other places it sprouted up. And pretty much all over the world, these institutions are now found. So the Buddha was able to create all of these institutions. And I now want to pay tribute to the person through whose work I stumbled upon this. And that was none other than Bhimrao Ambedkar. So Baba Saheb Ambedkar, in one of his speeches that he gave in 1948 to a group of students at Delhi University, talked about the voting procedures. Some years ago, when I was working on in this area, I stumbled upon that reference. Unfortunately, he was a first-rate Pali scholar. Most people don't know that he wrote his own Pali dictionary. It was never published. So he was a first-rate Pali scholar. But unfortunately, in this case, and I have no hesitation in saying this, he made a mistake. He uses the wrong word for the vote counters. So in these monasteries, you also had people who were formally election commissioners, so to speak. So he uses, I won't go into that detail, but he uses the wrong name for those. So I couldn't, for several years, I couldn't find out, what he was referring to. But ultimately, when I figured it out, I realized that he was talking about the equivalent of the Chief Election Commissioner. And he basically said something very interesting that I want to share with you. He said, the Indian tradition, historically, has never been static. The Indian tradition has always valued principles, but it has never valued the outward expression of those forms. Law, in particular, is something that comes and goes. What may be the law 100 years, what may have been the law 100 years ago can be changed today. And he, in fact, was deeply instrumental in changing that law. That is the Constitution of India. So he said, don't pay particular attention to those laws. Look at the process by which those laws are made. Look at the process by which those laws are amended and the purpose for which those laws are used. And that purpose can change as the society evolves. And so he also closes by saying, let us go back and study the glories of India. Remember, he may have been a deep critic of India as it existed, say, in 1947, but he was a patriot. He deeply loved India. He deeply loved Indian traditions. And he said, we need to go back and study those traditions. I have the speech. I won't have time to quote from it here. And he said, please don't, exactly what Nirmal Bose said. So I come back to Nirmal Bose. He went back and he said, do not slavishly imitate the West. We have enough in our own tradition to help us guide our own path as we move forward. That was the message of Nirmal Bose. That was the message of Ambedkar. That was also the message of our great ancient rishis. And that was certainly the message of the Buddha. Thank you very much indeed.
Dr. Mehtaji, thank you so much for a very enlightening talk. Particularly what Dr. Mehtaji said at the end, that the law is something which can be changed over time. This is exactly what the Buddha said towards the end, when he was assuming Mahaparinirvana. Then the question was asked as to how can we decide on many of the things which the situations did not really arise at the time of the Buddha. And the Buddha said, no mind, don't worry about that. Don't be rigid on the rules and regulations which were created during my time. We should be flexible on the basis of the places and on the basis of the time. So with change in time, with change in place, even the rules and regulations can be changed. This is what he clearly indicated. And then finally he said that the benchmark of all these rules and regulations is that where the benefits are there, then accordingly we have to act. Where the benefits are not there, then the things can be treated as redundant or obsolete. Okay, so it's very enlightening. Many of the important points which otherwise, for example, I just take for granted all what Professor Mehta said. I would take for granted, yes, these are the things. But then to look at the same thing from the lens of the contemporary research, this is amazing. So in fact, Dr. Mehtaji articulated all these things so clearly. And I'm just wondering if there are a few questions coming from the floor pertaining to the presentation. And because he touched many important areas. So any questions coming, just raise your hands and make it very precise if possible to give opportunity to as many. Okay, any questions? Please raise your hands.
You can start with the first question if you like.
Yes, over there.
Thank you, Professor Mehta, for such an enlightening talk. My question is related to some kind of cultural connect between India and all those other countries where Buddha travel and Buddhism is. I found a missing link, like India being the birthplace of Buddha, and it initiated from India. But currently, whenever I travel and interact with people all over that region, I didn't find, like you are saying that Buddhism has not disappeared from India. But I didn't find many scholars or many people from India or the kind of like connect which from other countries to India. Why this? I may be wrong in my observations, but whenever I've interacted with the people over there, I think somewhere we are lacking. We are not having that kind of researchers, or like I'm member of the International Expert Committee of Digital Dunang project.
Yes.
We have not seen much efforts from our scholars from India to write something on that particular, those 754 caves, and or like there was a IGNC initiated one professor.
I have that,
Yeah. But apart from that, I've not come across many initiative and activities. So why is this gap, or why we are not able to cash on that?
So I don't think I'll be able to give you a complete answer, but let me attempt a partial answer. I gave a talk about 2 weeks ago on where I touched upon some of these things. So let me take, so every society that India interacted with through Buddhism created its own version of the Tripitaka. So there's the Tibetan version, which is the Kanjur and the Tanjur. The Chinese Tripitaka is there, the Korean one is there, the Japanese is there, the Mongolian is there, the Burmese, the Sinhalese, the Cambodian, the Vietnamese. Each one has created a version which takes the core Pali Tripitaka and then creates a lot of things around it. In some cases, they don't take Pali as the central, but they take some of the other traditions, like the Mahayana and so on, as central, but take Pali also and create an accretion. So take China. The Chinese government, for the last 30 years, has put together a committee of 100 scholars, which are compiling the 20 editions that were created in China of this Tripitaka over 2,000 years. 20 separate Chinese emperors. This, again, story is something that Indians don't know. 20 separate Chinese emperors supported this work. And there are 20 separate layers of editions that they have compiled. They're putting together, in fact, you mentioned Dunhuang. There are tens of thousands of texts that have been recovered from Dunhuang. They're putting all of them together. Now, it made me fall off my chair when I saw the full extent of that. 300 million Chinese characters. 300 million Chinese characters. Just to give you an example, by contrast, the entire Mahabharata is about 2 million words. A Chinese character typically maps into more than one word. So we are talking about at least 100 crore words. 1 billion words are there. Now here is the tragedy. You mentioned why. There's not a single person in India who can read that. Why? First, it is Chinese. Very few people in India who read Chinese. Second, it's ancient Chinese. Very few people in China can read ancient Chinese. Third, it is ancient Buddhist technical Chinese. For example, there is a word that comes, a body without a head. It's 4 Chinese characters which say a body without a head. Now, if you don't know Buddhist technical Chinese, you won't know that it is takasilo, takshila. Because takasilo in Chinese sounds like a body without a head. So when those 4 characters come together, they're talking about takshila. So Professor Gay of Beijing University sent me 40 pages of references from the Chinese Tripitaka that he himself can't read. A professor of Chinese at Peking University cannot read that. First of all, it's very difficult for them to read it, and and in India, there's not a single person alive who can read that. There are maybe a few dozen people in the whole world, half of whom write only in Japanese. So the point is, and this is where I think IGNCA and the whole scholarly apparatus of India has to come together to do this on a war footing, because this is the product of thousands of years of interaction of tens of thousands of people, of the finest people in the world, who came together for the highest purpose imaginable. And I've just given you the Chinese Tripitaka. The same thing is true of Pali Tripitaka. By the way, you'll be happy to note, I'll tell you something very interesting. when Nalanda and Vikramshil and all these universities were destroyed, the fleeing monks went to Tibet. One of them, and they took with them all the manuscripts that they could save. Rahul Sankrityayan in the 1920s brought back that whole set, including some which date from that time. These are not copies, some of them are originals. One of which has a lament by one of the monks saying, this is now 1203. He's saying, I've fled from Nalanda and Vikramshil. I hope to go back to India. Of course, he never does, because the conditions never revert. But that collection of the Tibetan Tripitaka, Kanjur and Tanjur, is sitting in the Patna Museum. I went and took a picture of it, that whole wall. And then, fortunately, I gave it to the person who's a good friend, Professor B.V. Doshi and Rajiv Katpalia. The two of them, both are good friends. They are the architects of the new Nalanda University. So I said, please, and the centerpiece of Nalanda will be the library. I said, this is the soul of Nalanda. The manuscripts which went from Nalanda to Tibet, Rahul Sankrityayan, at great personal cost and risk, brought 60 mule loads of those to Patna and put them in the Patna Museum. Those should now be re-established in Nalanda University, and in some sense, the spirit that left India should come back. But why do I mention this? That spirit which somehow left India in terms of scholarship should come back. And we should build each one of those bridges, to the Korean Tripitaka, the Japanese Tripitaka, the Vietnamese Tripitaka, the Cambodian Tripitaka. All of these have to be built. And by the way, in doing so, we will recover aspects of our own heritage. And mind you, this is the model of how two civilizations or great civilizations can come together: the Chinese and the Indian, the Tibetan and the Indian, and so
on. In fact, this is a very serious question, extremely serious question. I would say that the way the Professor Mehta gave the answer is very true. So what we need to see things is the way the Chinese, they look at things. For example, Chinese, they are the China's communist nation. Religion is poison for them. Yet, they see religion not as their spiritual aspect. They see them as a property of their
culture,
their country. The property, meaning that because of Buddhism, many of these countries, they can slowly they're thinking of taking Buddhism as their property. And then the moment, for example, the IBC was created here, International Buddhist Confederation was created here like 2-3 years ago. Chinese, they instantly
created their own version.
They create their own version there. Whatever India is doing, they are doing it, and on top of that, they are doing some magnificent thing. Yeah. They destroy Buddhism now. They are awakened. They don't like Buddhism, but amount of the work which Professor Mehta mentioned about the Kanjur Tenjuru is a huge volume. 108 volumes of the Buddha's teachings and 200 volumes of the Indian masters' commentaries. Yeah. These were all digitized, so well digitized, did the critical the research, and the books were actually published. They don't like Buddhism, but they know that this is a treasure which they can feel proud of to the world, that they take as a pride. So now, India, this is what India is lacking. India, what is so important, for example, Mr. Mehta, he is from Jainism, but he's seeing this very objectively. This is a treasure of India. It's not about Buddhism. It's a treasure of India. So we should be able to see what is my personal inclination and what is the India's treasure. India's treasure, so many treasures. There's no harm in having more treasures. More the treasures, more the pride for the nation. So therefore, this is where India should really look at China to see how they're doing. They dislike Buddhism, yet they promote all these things so well as a treasure of the nation. So this is one thing I like to, this question is so pertinent.
By the way, may I disagree with you just a little bit on that? I agree with almost everything that you said, except the last part. I don't think the Chinese dislike or hate Buddhism. It's just that because the Communist Party has to take a particular position, they cannot accept the spiritual aspects of it. But they are very happy accepting the cultural aspects. Now they are restoring all the monuments, they're restoring all the texts. And in your private life, if you want to be religious, as long as you don't challenge the state, they're very happy with it, no problem. In fact, and not only that, you know this perhaps much better than I do, Mr. Xi Jinping himself has very strongly and actively promoted the restoration of Buddhist monasteries and the reading of Buddhist texts. He may not read them as a religious person, but he reads it for a fact. He reads the Buddhist scriptures as an expression of China's culture. So the point is, that's fine. Nirmal Bose was the same way. I don't see any particular difference between, sorry to put it this way, at least on this aspect. There are many others where you may question Mr. Xi Jinping, but on this aspect, he's no different from Nirmal Bose. He says, I'm not religious, but I believe this is a huge expression of our culture. Let's take it at that. Why not? And I can tell you, we are engaging very deeply with China as an institution. I'm personally engaging with China. I'm learning the elements of Chinese. We had a big delegation that came of some of the leading designers and entrepreneurs and architects, women, mostly women, who came and spent time with us. There's a huge yearning that they have to connect spiritually with India. Huge yearning. These are some of the elite of China. And this is a huge yearning. I did a program in Shanghai some years ago where we had some of the elite of China. This was for a large multinational, their global heads. I asked all the women I asked everybody, how many of you practice yoga? Half of them, there were 40 people in the room, half of them women. All the women raised their hands, all Chinese. And most of the men had the Buddhist prayer beads. It was a stunning thing. These are the elite of China. You go to Zhongnanhai, the main street in Beijing, any number of shops which sell the most gorgeous statues of Buddha. In fact, in India, I can't find things which are half as beautiful as the ones that I see in China. There's a deep yearning. Of course, they have their own system and their own values. That's fine. Let us link with them where we have commonality.
Okay, so before I invite another question, so what I like to acknowledge that when I said Chinese, I don't mean all the Chinese. There are many millions of Chinese actually still following Buddhism. I meant the communist Chinese.
Yeah.
It is the communist Chinese whose the basic idea is religion is poison. So on that basis, this is what I'm saying. And if somebody is signed up as a communist, the member of a communist party, you're not entitled to keep anything visibly there. This is the fact. So this is a fact that we have to know. And whereas if you don't acknowledge yourself as a communist member of the Communist Party, then it's fine. You can keep things. There's no problem there. Otherwise, as a communist member, you cannot do that. Okay, the next question.
By the way, sorry, Reverend, I have to take issue with that also. I'll give you actual reference. There is the head of the Kissinger Associates in China, a man by the name of Ramos. His Buddhist guru, Nanhai Chin, he said any number of leading members of the Communist Party would come to his sermons. Not openly, but in private they would come. So
this is what I'm saying.
So
not openly,
but in private.
Why not openly? Okay,
that time will come. That time will come.
Okay, very good. This is very positive. Thank you. But the reality flashed out, not openly. Thank you.
I think my question is related to the discourse which has taken place now,
Sure.
the Tripitakas and the Kanjur and Tanjore massacres. My first observation and query is that, was it the Sangha, the Buddhist Sangha, or the patronage of kings and nobles which were responsible for the institution building?
Yeah.
Number one. Number two, I differ that, there is a great deal of monks' role there in spreading the message, I believe. I have been traveling all across the Himalayan belt, and it is being recited. The Kanjur and Tanjore massacres are recited. Every season they are being recited.
Right.
But I believe this is just should go down, percolate down to the masses in the local language. That there comes the role of monks, I believe. Then it can be, made popular among the masses. In fact.
Yeah, I think no question about that. In fact, the whole reason why the Buddha used Pali as opposed to Sanskrit was because he wanted it to be close to the masses. So I think Buddhism pioneered the preaching in local languages as opposed to in the language of the elite. So absolutely, if they are not doing it, they should do it right away.
So the one thing that the questioner raised is about the Kanjur Tenjur Tibetak. So how to make it accessible to the common people? If only if we can do that, this is finally, I would say that this makes the total sense. So finally, what for the Buddha's teaching is not for the institution, it's not for the ism, it's for that the people should be benefited. How the people can get rid of suffering, how the people can have more happiness. So this will be happening only if the message of the Buddha goes down to the public. So this is the very true. I agree with you fully. So now in the regard, let's say that how to make it happen. This is the next question. Yes.
Yes. So highly thankful for your words of wisdom. So there are two concepts. One is nirvana and self-realization. These 2 points always remain in the point of contention between the two. So I'm myself a bit confused every time if there is any difference between the two. If it is so, what is that? Or is it same? Nirvana and self-realization.
Yeah, nirvana and self-realization.
Yes.
Yeah, not well. Again, it's a definitional thing. Usually, nirvana, of course, means that the journey is complete.
Complete, the highest end of human achievement.
Yeah, at least in the Buddhist and the Jain traditions, nirvana is the highest. Nirvana means extinction, bujna. Now, why bujna? Kya bujta hai? What is extinguished? It's all the cravings.
All the cravings, all the sufferings.
So the point is that you are truly free at that point, right?
Exactly.
So the point is that the definition of a pashu, pash means a noose. A pashu means something who's tethered, right?
Yeah.
So we are all tethered to our cravings.
Cravings.
So the
And
moment we
that
are
give
free of
rise to
cravings, we
sufferings.
truly become free, we truly become human. So that is the ultimate stage. Now self-realization is used somewhat loosely. Self-realization basically means that you cleared a little bit of space where that light
reach
can shine.
that point.
No, not reach that point. You see the light. So it's like,
Yeah.
so self-realization. So think of it. I'm now using an image from Urdu poetry where they say that before you reach an oasis, you smell the wind, right?
Yes.
Before you, आप कभी देखा होगा
When we get rid of our internal ego, we have to.
Right. So the point is that before we reach an oasis, you can remember in the desert it's very dry. The oasis is wet. Even before you can see the oasis, you can smell the oasis as you approach it.
Yes.
When you start to smell it, that is the self-realization point. When you reach the oasis,
So
I believe
it
that's
is a way before to nirvana.
yeah.
Thank you, sir. Thank
Okay,
you
so this requires a little bit of explanation here. Okay, let's say this is a very important point. This is more like philosophy. Nirvana. It is a connotation of, say, the being freed from your enemy. Enemy in the form of mental destructive thoughts. So being freed of the enemies. Enemy's job is to create problem on you, create misery on you. So to get rid of all the miseries through getting rid of all the problems. So that makes you be free from suffering. That is known as nirvana. Now about the self-realization. So there, the point is that it is, let's say, that I'm suffering from poverty. You are suffering from poverty, both of us. And then, say, you think of, okay, with poverty, I cannot help my community. And I said, with poverty, I cannot help myself. You're getting it? So both of us, we are thinking of removing the poverty, removing your suffering, remove the poverty. I remove the poverty for myself, self-realization, for me. Whereas you remove the poverty not for you, but to help others. So that is while both remove the poverty, but one is for oneself and the other is for the larger group. So one who achieves nirvana for oneself, just for one's own benefit, that is known as self-realization. And whereas the ones who achieve for oneself or for others, that is nirvana. But nirvana within that, both are nirvana. One is for oneself, one is for all. Okay, any more questions? Maybe last question? Okay, if not, so this is a great enlightening, particularly in the context of the social, the economic, the pattern of the development and the examples from the earlier, the Buddhist monasteries, and how the Buddha, that's something very interesting. I personally, as I become older and being associated with many institutions, universities, and the NGOs, I come to realize that what is the background of the leader that determines where this institution is going to be taken. So I learned from the professor, the Mehta, that the Buddha being a prince, he was already exposed to the administration a lot. Because of this, naturally, he's so expert in this. So, of course, from the Buddhist point of view, he's not only just with that background, but fully enlightened being, one who knows everything, but to be very pragmatic, very objective, not as a Buddhist. If you look at things, then as Professor Mehta rightly pointed out, there are so many of these enlightened beings who are all claim to be fully enlightened. But why the Buddha is successful in setting up such an institution, self-perpetuating institution, so his thought is that the background is that he already was exposed to administration. So all these beautiful, incredibly insightful the thoughts, research are done. I'm so amazed, impressed. So let us all give a big round of applause to him. Thank you so much, and thank you IGNCA for organizing such a talk. And I really appreciate IGNCA, everyone, to see if you can organize more of such talks in the future. And each one of the audience here, thank you so much.
Okay, so lastly, I would like to request Dr. Ramakapan to present the word of thanks.
It is my privilege to propose a vote of thanks on behalf of IGNCA. We express our heartfelt thanks to Professor Shailendra Mehta for accepting our invitation and delivering this year's memorial lecture. Sir, your lecture has thrown light on significant issues pertaining to Buddha's multifaceted personality. I hope that scholars as assembled here will give more thought to them in understanding these issues. Sir, once again, we are really thankful to you for insightful, thoughtful, and thought-provoking and enriching talk. Thank you very much, sir. Our gratitude to respected Deshidorji Dabdul, Director, Tibet House, New Delhi, who responded to our invitation despite his busy schedule to chair this 10th Anthropos Memorial Lecture. Sir, your observation as chairperson are quite relevant, and we thank you for this. We wish to place in the thought our gratitude to Member Secretary IGNC, Dr. Sachidanand Joshi, for the encouragement to us. He provides constant guidance in all our activities. Thanks to Dr. R.C. Dod, officiating Member Secretary and Director Talanidhi, to giving welcome address and be with us in today's evening lecture. Our thanks to various divisions, units of IGNCA who have provided their full support and cooperation in arranging today's lecture. Last but not the least, heartfelt gratitude to all those who have responded to our invitation and are with us in this lecture hall. I personally thank each one of you. Thank you. Please join us for the Prof.